Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Sonal Mehta, Lead Medical Advisor, INTAS. INTAS is a science-driven company, and as being a knowledge partner, we at INTAS, through this INTAS Women Health team, headed by Mr. Satpathy, has organized this webinar. I welcome you all to today's webinar given by eminent faculties Dr. Kaveri Banerjee and Dr. J.B. Sharma. Dr. Kaveri Banerjee will be speaking on thin endometrium, what is new, and Dr. J.B. Sharma will be speaking on tuberculosis and infertility. First, Dr. Kaveri Banerjee, she is a renowned ART specialist, MD, FRCOG. She is Medical Director, Advanced Fertility and Gynecology Center, New Delhi, Chairperson, Delhi State Chapter ISAR, and Commonwealth Fellow in Reproductive Medicine, London, UK. She has more than 8,000 IVF, ICSI, donor, and surrogacy cases. She has published many articles in national and international journals, and she has been invited as faculty in international conferences. She has, to her credit, many awards. With this, I welcome Dr. Kaveri Banerjee. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Sonal, for the kind introduction. And I thank INTAS and its entire team for putting up this webinar. It's a very important webinar on the endometrium. And all those who practice infertility would know how important it is to set the endometrium right to get our pregnancies. So today I am going to share certain slides on endometrium. Where are we today? This will be followed by Dr. J.B. Sharma's talk, much awaited talk on tuberculosis. We know that tuberculosis is very rampant in our country, and there are various dilemmas in the treatment, which I am sure will be handled in today's afternoon. But first, let us see on other aspects of the endometrium, and we will cover what is the definition, the prevalence, the assessment, the causes, and the treatment. Now, whenever we are measuring the endometrium, we measure it, the best way to measure it is with a transvaginal ultrasound with your bladder empty, and we have to measure the outer surface of one lining to the outer surface to the other side without including the myometrium. And this should be about midway, which is roughly 1 centimeter from the top of the endometrial lining. So your endometrium measurement in the sagittal plane has to be consistent every time to give you the right values for every patient. If you are not consistent with your measurement, you will get different values at different times on the same patients, and therefore measurement technique is very important. Now, why do we need to measure this endometrium thickness? It is one way of assessing our endometrial receptivity. Now, an endometrial thickness that cannot reach the threshold for embryo implantation, according to us, would be a suboptimal endometrial thickness. Now, actually, there is no agreement how thin is thin. Now, some have quoted less than 6, some have gone to 7, and some even 8. Now, 8 millimeters. Now, there's this large study of 40,000 embryo transfer in which they have concluded that for fresh cycles, less than 8 millimeters is considered thin, and for FET, less than 7 millimeters. So, less than that, the pregnancy rates reduced significantly. However, we must also keep in mind that in about 1,200 embryo transfers in the same group, and it's as a subset, in about 1,200 embryo transfer, 15 to 20% live birth rate was found in endometrium between 5 to 6 millimeters in fresh cycles and 4 to 6 millimeters in frozen cycles. So this is an important message that it's not that if your endometrium is less than 6, there will be no pregnancies at all. So the another important thing to keep in mind is the endometrium after your HCG day. So most of our endometrium studies are based on the thickness is based on the day of HCG, which is supposed to be the thickest, and then it goes into the progesterone changes and gets thicker and luteinized. Now in this study, they have found that after HCG, if you measure your endometrial thickness around the time of, say, IUI or embryo transfer, and if your endometrial thickness reduces by 20% to what it was on the day of HCG, your pregnancy rates can almost half. So this is less than 20% of the HCG day, and this is more than 20%. And you see here it's about 30%, and here it's about 60%. So even not just on the HCG day, but even later on, continuing to see the endometrial thickness gives us an idea of the overall success of this patient. Now, what is the prevalence? Some studies have shown that it can be as high as 40% in ovarian stimulation cycle. So they have taken various cutoffs of 6 millimeters, 7 millimeters. So this is pretty high. But in IVF cycles, it is very low, 2 to 10%. The reason being perhaps is because all the cycles which had the thin endometrium were removed from the analysis. So this is all IVF cycle going on to embryo transfer, and the cancel cycles were removed. So we all know that even in IVF cycles, the incidence and prevalence of thin endometrium is quite high. Now, of course, ultrasound, two-dimensional ultrasound is the basic tool by which we find out endometrial thickness. And while we do the thickness, we must also look at the pattern, and I'll have some word on volume and Doppler. Now, pattern is very important. Either you have a triple layer or you have intermediate echogenicity like the myometrium, or you have a hyperechoic intensity more than the myometrium. So this type of a pattern is the best. I mean, we all know how happy we are to see such an endometrium and how good the pregnancies are going to be in such an endometrium. So endometrium pattern is also a strong indicator of the probability of pregnancy. Trilaminar pattern with ET more than 6 suggests that implantation may not be compromised. So here you note the endometrium is not 8, 9, 10, it is 6. So reasonably thick endometrium with a good pattern is also a strong predictive of pregnancy. Now, volume 3 to 5 cc mid-cycle is optimum for implantation. However, many studies have tried to correlate it with pregnancy but could not find it. Doppler, again, the various zones into which you want to go, whether your blood flow is restricted to the outer layer or just to the endometrium or deep into the endometrium, and that way they have, categorized the Doppler blood flow and try to correlate with pregnancy. Some studies have found, but there are no long, robust studies which surely say that Doppler blood flow will indicate pregnancy. So it's not a strong marker yet. So in my unit, I follow the two-dimensional ultrasound and look at the endometrial thickness and look at the endometrial pattern to gauge the prognosis and to time the embryo transfer or IUI of my patient. Let us come to causes. What causes this thin endometrium? It could be infection, inflammation. So it could be an acute infection or it could be a chronic infection where you have destroyed the basal layer of the endometrium. So if it is partial destruction, we have hope. If it is complete destruction, there is not much hope. Now, iatrogenic, sometimes we cause endometrial damage. And how do we do that? By vigorous curettage. We are afraid that we may not let products inside and we go on curating sometimes. Sometimes when there is a myoma and we shave off the entire endometrium to take out that myoma, rather than giving a small nick and going inside. Using current unwisely, radiotherapy, of course, you cannot help. So these are the iatrogenic causes of thin endometrium. And medical, if a patient has been on long cycles of clomiphene citrate, progesterone therapy, combined contraceptive pill, they will present to you with a thin endometrium. So in your history, before you take your patient to the table, please take these histories, because your entire management of thin endometrium will depend on whether you found the cause or whether it is idiopathic. And we'll come to that later. So for example, if a patient has been having 3 cycles of clomiphene citrate in the previous cycles, and just this cycle she hasn't had, you may find slightly thin endometrium in certain women, not in all. Clomiphene citrate, we all know, does not lead to thin endometrium in all, but in some women, they will find thin endometrium. So it will be wise to stop clomiphene citrate for 1 or 2 cycles and then assess the endometrium again, rather than pumping her with medications that she may actually not need. So this initial screening of your patient is very important. Congenital Mullerian anomalies and premature ovarian failure. So for example, a septate uterus, you will find that on the septal aspect, that side of the endometrium is weak, and we all know that we may not need surgery for septum all the time. They can carry pregnancy. However, septate uterus, uterine anomalies, and ovarian failure, where the estrogen levels are always low in the lady, leads to thin endometrium. So these are causes. So you've got infection, you've got iatrogenic, you've got congenital anomalies, and then you have idiopathic, where you're not able to figure out a disease process. It could result from individual uterine architecture and intrinsic properties of that endometrium. And therefore, interestingly, this study, they have found that in which they have put in euploid embryos and the pregnancy rate, even in thin endometrium, the pregnancy rates were same, and it depended on the endometrium pattern rather than endometrium thickness. This subgroup of patients was when all other causes were ruled out. So you've ruled out infection, you've ruled out clomiphene citrate, you've ruled out DNC, but the patient has a thin endometrium, she's got a good pattern, you've put in euploid embryo, she will get pregnant. So this is important to know, that causal finding is key for your management. Then we come to treatment, and in treatment, it could be surgery, it could be treating infection, hormonal manipulation, improving the blood flow of the endometrium, and the new modalities which we will talk about. So in hysteroscopic adhesiolysis, there's been, of course, primary prevention, gentle curettage is important, and even in myomectomy, we have to be careful, as has been discussed. What is current? It may not be new, but what is current? We had a lot of discussion whether to put in, a loop or a device with taking out the copper. Is it important? Is it good? Or we just give the estrogens? The latest AHGL guidelines do suggest that putting in an inert material after hysteroscopic adhesiolysis and then giving estrogen do improve your overall outcomes as far as endometrial proliferation is concerned post-hysteroscopic adhesiolysis. Endometritis, infection. Now, this is so common, yet if you go into the literature, you will find very paucity of data, case series, very small studies. So how do you treat endometritis? Of course, you will take the symptoms and the signs. Plasma cells are pathognomonic in endometrial biopsy. In the hysteroscopy, you will find hyperemia, micropolyps. Doxycycline for 2 weeks for both partners is a good drug. Ciprofloxacin, metronidazole, ofloxacin, ornidazole are also good combination. Of course, higher up, we can go to ceftriaxone injection if they are not the PID treatment, which we have all been studying. However, there have been some studies in IVF patients where they've given oral antibiotics, and yet the endometrium does not proliferate back. It could be basal endometrium damage. So they have thought that maybe since it is a local problem, why don't we try intrauterine antibiotics and see whether it leads to better results. So ciprofloxacin, 200 milliliters in 200 milligrams in 100 ml has been taken about 2 to 3 ml and instilled into the endometrium every 3 days for about 10 times. So this took about 1 month, and then they have followed up with endometrial thickness and found good proliferation in certain cases. So intrauterine antibiotics is something that is being tried. Now, genital tuberculosis is a big topic, and today we are very, very happy to have Professor Sharma with us, and we'll wait for his presentation, and then I'm sure we'll have some questions after that. So now we come to hormonal manipulations. You have ruled out, DNC related changes, or you have treated it, yet the endometrium is thin. So what do? We add estrogens. We add external estrogens to build up the endometrial thickness. And you have oral estrogen, vaginal estrogen, and transdermal estrogen. Which is better? We are inundated by these products. Now we know that the vaginal and the transdermal, the first pass effect is bypassed. It leads to high local concentration. It could be equal or better in efficacy. We still don't have any strong consensus on that. Now, oral estradiol that is being used is usually estradiol valerate. And of course, people have been using conjugated equine estradiol, but valerate is the most preferred molecule as far as endometrial preparation is concerned. But we have had other hemihydrate preparations also. Now, oral estradiol and estrogel, if you compare, the oral undergoes first part metabolism. It increases the risk of venous thromboembolism. Bioavailability is less than transdermal, and high dose of oral can cause gastritis and nausea. On the other hand, gel, it avoids the first pass metabolism. It maintains stable serum estradiol level. It reduces the risk of venous thromboembolism, and it avoids other side effects, leads to gastritis and nausea, which the oral does. However, efficacy-wise, thickness-wise, both may be the same. And in India, oral is still slightly less expensive than the gel, and it would depend on your patient preference and their affordability. What we do is when the oral estradiol does not work, we do not get enough thickness, we do try the gel. And we have seen that some patients respond differently to different estrogen preparations, and gel may work better in some patients. And as I was talking about the hemihydrate and the valerate, hemihydrate, most physiological form, and valerate has slight modification. The hemihydrate diffuses through the cell membrane and binds to and subsequently activates the nuclear estrogen receptor. The affinity of estradiol valerate for the estrogen receptor is lower. However, most studies have shown valerate to be as good as hemihydrate. The load on liver may be slightly high, but yet again, there's no consensus. Now, how long do we use these estrogens? Now, you can give it, it's important to know when to start your estrogens. You have to start your estrogen in a down-regulated cycle. Now, does not mean you give GnRH agonist every time. Even if you scan your patient on day 1, day 2, you see a thin endometrium, you see no small follicles popping up, say at 9 millimeters or 10 millimeters, you start your estrogen. The earlier you start your estrogen in the menstrual cycle, the better response you'll get. Starting estrogen on day 4, day 5 may not be as good as starting on day 1, day 2. The reason being, in day 3, day 4, the natural follicle has already started growing, and there may be that you do not bypass the hormonal milieu of that natural cycle. So you will have to work on that follicle that is growing also. But if you start early, that growth of follicle will be suppressed and you will have a nice down-regulated cycle without a natural cycle follicle growing. So you can go up to 12 milligrams daily and you can give it for 2 to 3 weeks. And transdermal one actuation, one pump is equal to 0.75 milligram of oral estradiol valerate. Now, what are the other molecules? HCG. HCG is produced by endometrial epithelial cells in the secretory phase where HCG receptor have been identified. And HCG, of course, we know leads to ovulation, but it also perhaps has a local paracrine role in differentiation and endometrial receptivity by regulating different cytokines. So what has been done? 150 units, international units, subcutaneous daily starting from day 8 of the cycle has been given, and it has been given for 7 days in thin endometrium less than 6 mm till your endometrium reaches 7 millimeters. And studies have shown good outcome. However, these are small studies and large studies have not yet been done. And the question is, how do you give 150 IU of subcutaneous? There are products which have 10 and which have marked to small IU of HCG. But if you just have your 5000 IU HCG and you have 5 ml of water, you prepare it and you load it in your insulin syringe, and you can then give it according to the marks in your insulin syringe, like you give your Lupron. So 125 can be seen as it is here. So this is 100 and this is 150. This is 125. So this is the insulin syringe and you have a 1:1 dilution of the HCG. Again, small doses of GnRH agonist on the day of egg retrieval have shown to improve receptivity and thickness in patients with thin endometrium. So 0.1 milligram triptorelin acetate, 0.1 milligram leuprolide acetate given on the day of egg retrieval, and they have seen significant improvement in endometrial thickness and pregnancy. Now, these are medications to improve the thickness through the local paracrine actions. Now, how about improving the blood flow of the endometrium? Low dose aspirin, cheap, very favorite. It reduces the inflammation, it improves the uterine blood flow, it reduces subendometrial contractility. Now, Wittgenstein, 1997-2000, good improvement in endometrium blood flow and pregnancy rate, may not translate into increase in endometrial thickness. So aspirin, many studies have shown good pregnancy rate, but not necessarily increase in endometrial thickness. Newer products, other products which are known to improve perfusion are vitamin E, pentoxifylline. They increase the intracellular cyclic AMP and therefore have vasodilatory effects. Now they are used in symptomatic treatment of vascular pathologies, and they are also antioxidant and vasodilator. They have been used widely in patients receiving radiotherapy. Pentoxifylline 800 milligram, vitamin E 1000 units, and they've given it for a long time, and shriveled thin endometrium have slowly started their perfusion. Sildenafil, a very, very popular product. It enhances the vasodilator effect of nitric oxide by reducing the cyclic GMP degradation. So again, a vasodilator of the endothelial smooth muscles, improving the blood flow and therefore helping in the endometrial proliferation in the secretory phase. Now, the dose is 25 milligram every 6 hourly, but you could give it 12 hourly to 8 hourly also. We give it, it stopped just prior to HCG administration, and people have had good successes with Asherman's syndrome. However, large studies, RCT, have not shown a strong benefit of sildenafil. The evidence is there, but it's weak. L-arginine, nitroglycerin, again, good vasodilatory effects have been used by some groups in resistant patients, and we've seen that the endometrial thickness does improve. So what are the new modalities? And we've heard a lot about, GCSF, PRP, stem cells. Let's go through it a little bit. Now, what is granulocyte colony stimulating factor? It's actually a cytokine, and it increases the endometrial stromal cell decidualization, leading to proliferation and differentiation of the endometrium. Now, how do we administer it? We either give it subcutaneous or we give it intrauterine. It's available as 300 microgram, and you give it on the 10th or 12th day, and then you give it on your HCG day, and you give it on your ectocup day. So 2 to 3 instillations, 48 to 72 hours later. So this was started by Gleicher. He did the GCSF infusion, and in donor patients, he did see good results. But when it was done in large studies, similar increases in pregnancy rate was not found. However, recent studies have started showing that the effect of GCSF on infertile women undergoing IVF treatment, a meta-analysis. So in this, it increased endometrial thickness was detected. This was a meta-analysis of more than 500 patients. And in this review of 2015, again, they did in recurrent miscarriage and implantation failure, they did find that it did improve the pregnancy rate, but again, they said we need larger studies. Subcutaneous administration also led. So in our unit, we thought, well, this is the product people are talking about. We are getting a lot of patients with thin endometrium. We've tried our estrogen, we've tried our sildenafil. Now let's try the GCSF and see whether it works or not. Now, this was the first study in the country to try subcutaneous granulocyte colony stimulating factor. We tried subcutaneous because we thought it is an easier way of application, and it is also GCSF is also known in improving the oocyte quality in some studies. So we thought it'll act on the endometrium also, it may act on the oocyte also. More important than that, it is also an easy way of administration. It does not require an extra procedure of intrauterine admission, and also the recurrent passage into the endometrium at this critical time when the endometrium is developing, we were not very comfortable with. And so we decided that let's go ahead with the subcutaneous way of instillation. And so it was a retrospective study. We had 107 patients, and they ranged from 23 to 40 years for about 6 months. And in group 1, we gave GCSF. In group 2, we did not give GCSF. And in group 1, we had 48 patients. We gave the GCSF on the 10th or 12th day, and we repeated it in 72 hours. They also had estrogen, sildenafil, and aspirin. And in group 2, they only had estrogen, sildenafil, and aspirin without GCSF. And the category target of endometrium that we wanted was 7.5. So in our unit, we did not transfer till the endometrial thickness of at least 7.5 was reached. So in group 1, 4 cases were cancelled because they did not reach 7.5. In group 2, 15 cases were cancelled. And therefore, all other parameters were equal. In group 1, which received GCSF, we got a 59% pregnancy rate, and in group 2, we got a 27% pregnancy rate, which was a statistically significant difference. Now, this was the first study which showed that subcutaneous GCSF in endometrium has a hugely promising role. However, we have to add caution that this is retrospective, a very small group of patients, and it needs to be replicated in larger groups in a prospective way. So now we come to autologous platelet-rich plasma. Now, platelets Also, they have from the alpha granules, they release cytokines and VEGF, growth factors, which lead to endometrial proliferation. Now, how do you make PRP? Now, the ICMR guideline is very clear that we cannot do stem cells in any center without proper clinical trials. But in PRP, there is a rider that if you are taking the plasma from the same patient, making it in your own center without taking the product outside and giving it back in the same center, then it is allowed as of now. So how do we make it? We take about 10 ml of blood and then we centrifuge it for about in 1000 RPM for about 5 minutes to 10 minutes. Then we take the buffy coat with some plasma. We again centrifuge it and then we take the sediment with the platelets and very little of plasma and we do intrauterine injection. And when do we do it? We do it on the 10th day and then again 72 hours later. Some people have also given a third infusion. And the volume of infusion should be less than 1 millimeters. And it is given with an embryo transfer catheter. And you have to be very, very gentle about it. Studies are promising and are coming up to show that perhaps the endometrium can be regenerated. Now, what about stem cells? We hear so much about stem cells regenerating the endometrium, and these stem cells transdifferentiate into stromal and endothelial cells. Now, this was a very interesting study conducted by Professor Dr. Neeta Singh at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, in which they took the stem cells from the patient. They isolated mononuclear cells, and with this, they created 3 ml of stem cells, concentrated mononuclear cells, and then they checked for the CD34 count cells. And on the same day, they injected these stem cells using a collection needle, and they have implanted it into, they went through the lateral fornix and implanted it in the subendometrial zone transmyometrial. So they delivered it at 3 sites, the fundus, the anterior and the posterior myometrium. And the initial studies showed that they were Asherman's patients. They were all amenorrheic. 5 out of 6 resumed menstruation. So this was very, very encouraging. And recent studies, recently I had a chat with Dr. Neeta's group, and they're saying that yet it's still under the trial. It is good where at least a little bit of basalis endometrium is there. But in those patients where the basalis is completely destroyed, even stem cells may not help. But the studies are still ongoing. Now, before I close, a few words about endometrial receptivity array. Now, we know that though it is not particularly related to thin endometrium, but it is used to check the endometrial receptivity, which window to implant to improve our results. So either you have a receptive window or you have a non-receptive window. And then if you have a non-receptive window, you do the test again and you try to implant the embryos on the right window. So a day 3 embryo may need to be implanted on day 2 or day 5 or day 4, depending on which is the receptive window. Now, a lot of good studies coming up saying that it is helping. However, there are also studies coming up, for example, this one, which is saying that further large prospective studies are needed to elucidate the role of ERA testing in both good prognosis and RIF. So, which subgroup of patients should we do it? Should we do it in all failures or in certain subgroup? Now, this particular study from Japan has said that there is intra-patient variability in the ERA test. Perhaps independent groups should be able to perform studies on the ERA test. Most of the studies are coming from the same group, which is creating the ERA test kit. So Perhaps there may be bias, but more people should come out who are independent groups. So this group said that there is lack of consistency in particular cycle. So what do we do at our center when we see a patient with thin endometrium? So first of all, like I went to the previous slides, rule out any cause. Treat endometritis. You can give antibiotics, you can do hysteroscopy, you have to monitor in a non-medicated cycle. And that one cycle will clear your doubts as to what is the cause of this thin endometrium. Is it because she was on pills for a long time, or what is it? So at least 1 or 2 cycles without medications. And then you build your endometrium in your treatment cycle. You could have plain estrogen. You can change the preparation if one preparation does not work. You can even change protocols. Letrozole has been used, low dose HMG has been used. And especially in adenomyosis and endometriosis, when we are preparing the endometrium in FET cycles, I have seen down-regulated cycles do much, much, much better as far as pregnancy rates are concerned. So I, not only for stimulation, but even for FET, I prefer down-regulated cycle with GnRH analogs, especially in these two patients, category of patients. Now, preparation can be in a natural cycle, it can be in a hormone replacement cycle, or it could be a stimulated cycle. In the hormone, the natural cycle can be a pure natural, or you can add, say, letrozole, or to make it a modified natural cycle. Hormone replacement cycle can be without your downreg or with your downregulated. Stimulated cycle can be with HMG. We usually go for HRT cycles, and we do downregulate it in adenomyosis, endometriosis, and in failure cases where we feel the prep will be better. And if one preparation does not work, as I've mentioned, we will shift to the other preparation. The adjuvants that we use are sildenafil, GCSF, and aspirin. And lately, we are thinking in terms of GnRH analog, low dose HCG, and PRP. So ensure down regulation. Now, this is very, very critical in your FET cycles, your donor cycles, whichever cycle you're preparing your endometrium, even your stimulation cycle, you're doing your IUI. You should not start your IUI when there is a follicle seen on day 2, day 3. It may be a non-hormonal producing follicle, but that is so very basic and so important for your success. So please do a day 2, day 3 scan before you start any treatment cycle, IUI, IVF, FET, whatever. And monitor the growing follicle. You know, whenever we are looking at the endometrium, we've given estrogen, we sometimes forget to see the adnexa and not see the growing follicle. Most of the time, the follicle will not be there, it would be downregulated, but sometimes it is growing. And if you don't give attention to it, and if you don't plan according to its rupture and endometrial thickness, you will miss the window and you will not get your result. So progesterone is given from the day of endometrial right thickness, if it is a downregulated cycle, or if there's a follicle from day of ovulation. No transfer if there is any amount of spotting or fluid seen. Good embryos will improve your results even in a 6 millimeters endometrial thickness. Use of good transfer technique. This is so key for especially these patients. Persistently thin, do not try more than 2 to 3 attempts. And after 2 to 3 attempts, really it's time to sit back, stop treatment, adoption, or surrogacy. We'll come to these questions if we have time later on. And there are a lot of studies on thin endometrium, especially this one, which has, ruled out any kind of adjuvant. And I feel that, we rely a lot on Western literature to guide us. But especially now with the Lancet study, with the hydroquinone study, in this, they have just ruled out aspirin to be a good adjuvant. And I feel these studies are not reflective of our population. There is no mention of endometritis. There's gross generalization. And we sincerely need to conduct our own studies. So I'd like to conclude by saying that thin endometrium is a strong marker of poor endometrial receptivity, but not always. Please rule out treatable causes, go stepwise, change protocol if needed, explore vitamin E, pentoxifadine, HCG, PRP, and stem cells should only be used in clinical trial setting. And last but not the least, know where to draw the line. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving us very insightful lecture with practical tips, ma'am. And there are many questions because of time constraint. I will be asking a few of them. They are asking if there is a thin endometrium.
Can we first have Dr. Sharma's lecture? Hello, sir.
Hi,
Okay.
hi.
Okay,
and then we'll take the questions in the end.
Fine, ma'am. Fine. So let me introduce Dr. Sharma. He is Professor OBGY, All India Medical Institute, Delhi, and he is the recipient of many awards. He is chairperson, Eurogyne Foxy 2020-22, and he will be speaking on tuberculosis and infertility.
If I can get familiar with the way you talk.
With this, I welcome Dr. Sharma.
Am I audible? Sorry. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you
Yes,
are audible.
Acha, okay. So should I start? Okay.
Yes,
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sonal Mehta, and I really am thankful to Dr. Kaveri Banerjee for giving me this opportunity to interact with the our colleagues and delegates today. And so we'll be discussing about role of female genital tuberculosis in infertility. And yeah. So we know that tuberculosis is a major global health problem. That I'm talking about of the general tuberculosis, with an estimated 2.2 billion people affected and almost 10.4 million people each year. And but pulmonary tuberculosis remains the most infectious and commonest type of tuberculosis, but extrapulmonary TB is becoming more prevalent. And for us gynecologists, female genital tuberculosis is an important cause of significant morbidity and short and long-term sequelae for the affected women. So it's a very major cause of infertility in India. And the incidence of infertility varies from 1% in USA to 1.19% in various parts of India. And like at AIIMS, because we deal with patients referred from areas like Bihar and others, so our incidence is almost 16% in case of infertility patients. And in incidence of infertility in FGTB is almost 42%. So genital TB always occurs secondary to pulmonary tuberculosis, but you may not have findings of pulmonary TB at that time when the patient come to us, but it can be because of extrapulmonary TB also, and the spread to genital areas from lungs or other areas occur through hematogenous or lymphatic route, or sometimes by the direct spread from abdominal organs. And various genital organs affected are frequency-wise fallopian tubes almost 100%, 90 to 100% cases, endometrium about 50 to 70, 80% cases, ovaries 20 to 30%, cervix 5 to 15%, and vagina and vulva rare 1% cases each. The various symptoms in genital tuberculosis are as follows, but I must warn that almost 10 to 12% patients, they may be asymptomatic. And so, but otherwise, other patients may not have typical general symptom, but some of them may have fever with night sweats, loss of appetite, weight loss, poor general condition. But quite, significantly, most patients of infertility with genital TB, they tend to be, they tend to be quite healthy actually. And then menstrual dysfunction initially, basically tuberculosis causes ulcerative lesions on the endometrium. So at that time, patient will have menorrhagia. Sometimes old patient may have postmenopausal bleeding, but later on tuberculosis eats away the endometrium. So patient will have oligomenorrhea, hypomenorrhea, and amenorrhea, which is usually secondary, but rarely can be primary also. And amenorrhea can also be because of involvement of the endometrium blood plus involvement of ovaries, and it can also be because of antigonadotropic effect of the tuberculous toxins. Then infertility is very, very common in genital tuberculosis, and both primary and secondary can happen. And then it can cause mass in abdomen, abdominal pain, chronic pelvic pain, acute abdomen, abdominal gland discharge. So this thing. And similarly, as signs are concerned, so there may be no physical sign in about 10 to 12% cases, but otherwise on systemic examination, there may be mild to moderate grade of fever, lymphadenopathy in lymph node TB, chest crepitation on pulmonary examination. Abdominal examination may show mass abdomen, which can be vague or definite, and there can be ascites, there can be doughy feel of the abdomen. So, I mean, if you compare ovarian, this tuberculosis versus ovarian cancer or other tumor, the ovarian cancer or ovarian cyst will be very definite mass. While in case of tuberculosis, the mass tends to be more of vague, and ascites and doughy feel is there. On vaginal examination, there may be normal finding initially, but they can be uterine enlargement due to pyometra. They can be adnexal masses, induration, tubo-ovarian masses, fullness and tenderness in pouch of Douglas. And quite often, the tenderness may not be because of tuberculosis, it may be because of the secondary infection with the other bacteria. The rare signs can be hypertrophic or ulcerative lesions of cervix, vagina, and vulva. And these conditions can masquerade like cancers, like cervical cancer, vaginal cancer, vulval cancer. So we need to take biopsy, which will confirm the diagnosis. Then patient can come with the labial mass, Bartholin swelling. Patient can present sometimes in psychovaginal or rectovaginal fistula. This is very important. I have seen cases of RVF as well as psychovaginal fistula due to tuberculosis. And especially if the lady is unmarried and she had no sexual relationship, and then she develops VVF or RVF, then you must suspect tuberculosis. And I had a case in which we took a biopsy from the fistula site, and it came out to be tuberculosis. And while I was planning to do repair, the fistula healed itself on ATT itself. So don't be in a hurry to repair the fistula. First give ATT, and quite often small fistula may heal of their own. As far as diagnosis is concerned, so there is, the family history or history of anti-tuberculosis therapy in the past is very, very important, and past history of TB or ATT also is very important. And it is significant because quite often our adolescent girls or young women, they tend to look after their elderly parents, grandparents who died of pulmonary tuberculosis or other types of tuberculosis, and then they can catch infection when they are young. So that history must be taken. Then the general physical examination for any lymphadenopathy, any evidence of tuberculosis at any other site in the body like bone, joints, skin, etc. Chest examination, abdominal examination, examination of external genitalia, vulval, vaginal tuberculosis, and then cervical examination for any cervical TB, bimanual examination for endometrial fallopian TB, aids in diagnosis of genital TB. So you have to be very careful. I had at least 2 girls. One was with TO masses and unmarried girls. So I was thinking of how to take sample from her. And then on careful examination, I found that her knee had a small sinus from where we took the discharge, and it turned out to be tuberculosis. And when we gave her ATT, her TO mass also disappeared. Another lady had lymph node palpable. When we took the biopsy from the lymph node, it was tuberculosis positive. And along with the treatment of tuberculosis, healed her tubo-ovarian mass also. So please do have a careful examination of these women. You may find evidence of tuberculosis at other sites. Now, as far as investigations are concerned, general investigation can be done like complete blood count, raised ESR, anemia, leukocytosis, lymphocytosis. But let me tell you, these are not very specific, but you should do them, but they can't diagnose tuberculosis or rule out tuberculosis for certain. X-ray test is important to confirm or exclude respiratory tuberculosis, but quite often, almost 80-90% time, the X-ray test is normal. But you may get old healed lesions of tuberculosis or mediastinal lymphadenitis sometimes. Then Mantoux test, has limited utility, but if you have a positive reaction of more than 10 millimeter, it may go a little bit in favor of tuberculosis, but not diagnostic. Serological tests are not done anymore, but you can do IGRA test or this, gamma interferon test. They have some sensitivity. They are equivalent to Mantoux test basically. Then endometrial sampling, biopsy or aspirate, we tend to take with Carman's number 3 or 4 cannula, and you take the specimen in premenstrual phase, day 21 to day 23, and don't mix the blood with it. Take the white specimen of the endometrial biopsy and send. You divide the white specimen into 4 or 5 parts. One part to be sent in normal saline for acid-fast bacilli on microscopy, then on culture. And guinea pig inoculation we are not doing anymore, but one part is done for PCR reaction, polymerase chain reaction, and also for GeneXpert. And then one part is sent in formalin solution for histopathological evidence of epithelioid granuloma. Typical epithelioid granuloma may not be visible because there's not enough time for the endometrium to form after menstrual shedding, but even local lymphocytosis can go to some extent in favor of tuberculosis. So this mycobacterium smear and culture are important from the endometrial sample you do, and you can do LJ medium, you can do other Vectec culture, MGIT is very good, you need to do. And PCR, I mean, though very often done by our colleagues from private practice, we detect mycobacterial DNA in both PTB and EPTB, but it has many disadvantages. It can be false positive. If you start treating every patient with positive PCR, I mean, you will be treating probably half of the population. So it tend to tell us more about latent tuberculosis. So, I mean, do we really need to treat them? That is a big question mark. So, but as a general policy, we don't treat patients only on the basis of positive PCR. But yes, it can be a diagnostic modality which can be used to do laparoscopy or histoscopy on these patients. So, I mean, like what we do in AMG, if the patient has got AFB microscopy positive, AFB culture positive, GeneXpert positive, or histopath epithelioid granuloma positive, then they are positive for tuberculosis, then we don't do anything else on them. But if they are only positive PCR, then we tend to do laparoscopy, histoscopy on them. And if on lapro or histo we find any findings along with positive PCR, along with infertility, then we tend to take it as a possible case of tuberculosis and we treat it. This is called composite reference standard, in which we combine the various tests to increase the pickup rate of tuberculosis. So this just a quick result of the various tests which we do. As far as radiological imaging is concerned, in an active case of tuberculosis or suspected case of tuberculosis, we tend to avoid hysterosalpingography because it can flare up of the disease. But it's a otherwise good modality. Many patients actually they are unsuspected, and HSC is done as a part of routine infertility protocol. So it can give us good pictures of tuberculosis. But unfortunately, those patients tend to be very advanced cases. Then, as far as role of other radiological imaging techniques are concerned, like ultrasound, CCT, MRI, PET scan, so they are more useful for tuberculous tubo-ovarian masses, and they may help us in differentiating between ovarian cancer and tuberculous masses. And do them only when you have clinical suspicion of TO mass. And of course, endoscopy. So this is the AFB microscopy showing red colored tubercle bacilli on endometrial aspirate in the case of GTP, but unfortunately, we don't get such picture very often. And this is the GeneXpert machine. GeneXpert is available in the whole of country now, and you can take the help of local dot center. They can do it free of cost for you. This is a study which we published in European Journal that role of GeneXpert is useful, but in our experience, it picks up only about 30% cases, it misses 70% cases. So but when it is positive, it's a very specific test. So its sensitivity is only 30%, but specificity is almost 100%. So this is the HSC normally we avoid, but when done as a part of tubal factor infertility in developing countries, it's a very economical test, and you can get up many findings. Like this patient was very advanced case. You can see bilateral tubal block with rigid pipe stem-like appearance, and there's venous intervasation also. So then we tend to do laparoscopy. It is a direct visualization. So laparoscopy is a very important tool, and most patients of infertility with tuberculosis, they will require laparoscopy anyway. So that we can prognosticate the disease also, and we can plan further treatment also for the patient. So we should tend to do laparoscopy, and as a general principle, we are doing laparoscopy for all positive PCR patients without starting ATT in the beginning. So various laparoscopy findings can be tubercle zone, peritoneum, ovary, cages, nodules, tubo-ovarian mass, hydrosalpinx, pyosalpinx, BD tube, tobacco pouch appearance, abdominal pelvic and perihepatic adhesion, and cystic ascites. Out of these tubercles, cages, nodule, and BD tube, these are very specific. So they are definitive of tuberculosis, but other investigation like other finding like tubo-ovarian mass, hydrosalpinx, pyosalpinx, block tube, tobacco pouch appearance, pelvic, abdominal or perihepatic adhesion, and cystic ascites, they are probable finding of tuberculosis. But in presence of positive PCR, then we make it a diagnosis of probable TB and we start the treatment. Abdominal perineal tuberculosis sometimes can masquerade as ovarian cancer, and even CA125 levels can be raised in them. And many times we end up in doing laparotomy in a suspected case of ovarian cancer, while laparoscopy could have been the answer. So we can avoid. And if you do open an abdomen for ovarian cancer, it turns out to be abdominal pelvic tuberculosis, please don't make it a prestige event. You just take biopsy and come out and give AT2 to the patient, because you may not be able to complete the surgery and there is not much gain. In any case, you have to give AT2 to the patient. So, and surgery is very difficult in these patients. There is real risk of injuring the bowel, small bowel as well as large bowel. So avoid doing surgery. So this is another study which we published. In this, we could find various findings like tubercles on peritoneum, tubular masses, cages nodule, encephalitis, pelvic adhesion, hydrosalpinx, biosalpinx, BD2, tobacco pouch appearance, inability to see tube due to adhesions. So these are the various findings. You can say there is hydrosalpinx, congestive fallopian tube and tubercles. Again, cages nodule, you can say shaggy areas, and obliterated pouch of Douglas. And various types of adhesions are very common. Almost 48% patients have perihepatic adhesions in laparoscopy, and these adhesions are very vascular, and adhesiolysis can increase the risk of bleeding and flare up of the disease. This is the, you can see important cause of adhesion between liver and diaphragm. We can see this perihepatic adhesion in this patient. Again, perihepatic adhesion, and this. You can see the BD tube, and very, like, in this case, calcified tubes are there. Very advanced case of tuberculosis, unfortunately. Again, cages nodules on peritoneum and omentum. Again, hydrosalpinx on the right side. So again, and this hydrosalpinx is not specific for tuberculosis. Similar finding can be there in chlamydia, gonorrhea, mycoplasma also. But positive infertility patient, positive PCR for tuberculosis, and then this finding, then it's a probable case of tuberculosis. We should start the treatment. Again, in this case, you can see it's a very specific. You can see very big tubercle here, and the hydrosalpinx is also there. So this is a very specific case of tuberculosis, and we can start treatment. Again, in this case, there is cages nodule on the right side, and it's very specific for tuberculosis. There is, along with the fallopian tube, also shows some bluish discoloration and distension. Again, hydrosalpinx. Again, hydrosalpinx and frozen pelvis and adhesions. Hydrosalpinx. And in this patient had both tuberculosis and endometriosis. So sometimes endometriosis, normally endometriosis and tuberculosis, they're like, if you diagnose tuberculosis, rule out endometriosis and vice versa. But in India, tuberculosis is so common, sometimes it can be combined. It can be seen along with endometriosis, or sometimes in malignancies. Again, endometriosis with tuberculosis. Again, in this case, you can see the angry looking uterus, fallopian tube, so very hyperemic tubes and uterus. In this case, you can see the shaggy areas and lot of tubercles on the uterus and pouch. And in this case, then we have described this hanging gallbladder sign. If you see, perihepatic adhesions are very common. So you can see in the first picture, gallbladder is being lifted up. Second case, it's lifted up more. And third case, it's highly lifted up. So gradual, basically, hanging gallbladder is seen, and there is a cages nodule also in the picture. Again, perihepatic adhesions, hanging gallbladder sign. Again, hanging gallbladder sign, perihepatic adhesions, and nodules on the omentum. In this case, we also described, blue python sign. In this case, when we inject dye, basically the tube becomes distended, alternate constriction and dilatation like a blue python. And later on, the tube may become patent also. So they delayed spill is there in these patients. And then this is kissing fallopian tube sign. In this case, you can see the cages nodule. So it's a specific case of tuberculosis. So cages material came out on both fallopian tube, and then the two fallopian tube got fused. So kissing fallopian tube, you can say. So again, can be seen in tuberculosis. Then ascending colonic adhesion in the right 2/3 and upper 1/3 of the junction of the ascending colon, there can be an adhesion, thick adhesion, common. And then these are the various cages nodules, frozen pelvis, and hydrosalpinx in case of tuberculosis. And then the laparoscopy and HSC again. So various, again, other adhesions, frozen pelvis, adhesions. Like a lot of adhesions are there. And you can say cages nodule and this the liver. Again, so this is another sign which we found out, Valda, that there are the fallopian tube become very constricted and like calcified, so they resemble a dry tree branch sign. Okay, in this case, this is parachute sign which we are describing in abdominal perituberculosis. So the ascending colon gets adherent to the anti-abdominal wall, and if you put the second port in this area, there is a real risk of injuring the ascending colon. So please, when you are putting a second port, avoid putting on the right side, put it on the left side, because tuberculosis on the left side is rare. Okay, again, the same thing. So you can say the parachute sign with the ascending colon adherent to the anti-abdominal wall, and you can see small cages nodule on the mesentery. Again, cages nodule and ascending colon adherent to the anti-abdominal wall. Okay, so this we have published, and then you can say frozen pelvis syndrome. And then sometimes there is a sigmoid colonic adhesive band also in these patients, and this you can say. Yeah. So this is also common, and we can say the peritubal adhesions and sometimes hyperemia of the tubes and hydrocephalus in these patients. Again, a lot of adhesions are there. Colonic adhesion. Yeah, you can say. So laparoscopy is superior to PCR basically. So we observed, but doing laparoscopy and hysteroscopy on these patients can be hazardous, and there is increased complication rates there. Sometimes you can't see the pelvis. There may be excessive bleeding. There may be peritonitis. There is a risk of bowel injury also. So please, it should be done by experienced persons. So this is a flow chart algorithm for diagnosis of male genital tuberculosis. If a suspected case of TB comes to you, we need to do premenstrual endometrial sampling on them for smear, culture, gene expert, PCR, and histopathology. And if the positive for tuberculosis indicates confirmed FGTB, like if AFB positive, culture positive, histopath positive, or gene expert positive. But if this is, we call it composite reference standard. But if the CRS is negative and PCR only is positive, then we do laparoscopy or hysteroscopy on them. And if laparoscopy shows a definite finding or suspected finding, so definite finding confirmed case of FGTB, we start ATT. If laparoscopy shows a probable finding like stroke-colored fluid, hyperemia of the tube, dense pelvic adhesions, or hydrosalpinx, pacifix, etc., this probable FGTB, we start the treatment. And then if the mild findings are also there, like flimsy adhesion, dilated tortuous tubes, etc., then possible FGTB, again start treating. And if similarly, if the positive PCR with TO masses are there on ultrasound, CT, MRI, PET, we get tubular mass, then also it can be a probable case of tuberculosis, so ATT is advised. But if only PCR is positive, but definitely tests are negative, and laparoscopy, hysteroscopy, ultrasound, they are all negative, then it's not a case of ATT. So only on the basis of PCR, we don't make the diagnosis, then we don't start ATT. And when the patient with ATT, then this is the older slide, but we give them basically 2 HRZD, that means 2 months of isoniazid, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol for 2 months daily, followed by 4 months of isoniazid, rifampicin, ethambutol. That is a continuation phase, and it has to be given every day. And you can give it through DOT centers also, where it's given free of cost. Okay, for MDR TB, rarely it can also happen in genital TB. That's beyond the scope of this lecture. For that, we need to take the help of the infectious disease control patient, but then you have to give basically 6 to 8 drugs for 6 to 9 months intensive phase and 18 months continuation phase. Okay, so these are the various medicines available on DOT center and all. And or otherwise, you can say from the market also, e.g. like AKT4 for 2 months, AKT3 for next 4 months you can give. So, and then genital tuberculosis and STD production, that's Dr. Kaveri has already highlighted that important part. So, but I mean, what we do, once you have given ATT to these patients, after that again, I tend to repeat laparoscopy, hysteroscopy on them. And if at the end of the therapy of ATT, we do laparoscopy, hysteroscopy, if their tubes are patent, endometrium is normal, they can go for normal ovulation or ovulation-inducing drugs, and they can try normal conception. But if their tubes are blocked and endometrium is normal, then they can go for IVF-ET. But if their tubes are blocked and endometrium also has more than grade 3 adhesion, which cannot be cut easily, then they go for surrogacy. But if their ovaries are also abnormal, sometimes the tuberculosis eats away the ovaries, then they go for adoption. So at the end of the therapy, at least even if the patient may not have a baby, but at least we can give them a definitive diagnostic opinion, and then the patient can have suitable treatment in the form of either IVF-ET, surrogacy, or adoption. So this is important. And but I mean, assisted reproduction has a great role, especially IVF embryo transfer has very good results provided their endometrium is normal. Thank you very much. So any question, please?
Yeah, thank you, sir, for giving us a very insightful lecture and giving us very nice images and practical tips. There are some, there are some questions I'll be asking you. To Dr. Sharma, sir, approach to tubo-ovarian mass abscess reaching up to an anti-abdominal wall.
Tubo-ovarian abscess adherent to anti-abdominal wall.
Reaching up to means it is almost adherent. That's what.
No, is it abscess or mass?
They are abscess.
Okay, because if there is abscess, then you have to do surgical treatment. But the surgical treatment has to be minimal, because if the problem is if you do laparotomy in these patients, you try to remove the tubes and ovary. That is the ideal treatment if possible, but they tend to be adherent to the bowel. So there is a real risk of hinging the sigmoid colon or small bowel in them. So it's better to just drain that abscess.
Correct.
And if possible, I mean, then we give them ATT, so drain the abscess, which can be done under ultrasonic control also, and then just give them ATT, and after that, then we can do more definitive surgery. Because if at that time we tend to remove that, I mean, can be done sometimes if the patient is very sick, and all you have to do, take the help of surgeon and try to remove that tube and ovary of that side. But it becomes very difficult, and risk of injury are there, and you have to give ATT anyway to these patients for 6 months. So as a general principle, whenever I'm doing laparoscopy, histoscopy on them, if I find anything, I don't do any adhesiology at that time. Even histoscopy adhesiology I don't do. We give them ATT, and after second sitting, then we tend to do the adhesiology and histoscopy adhesiology to avoid flare-up of the tuberculosis as well as to avoid injury.
Right. Second question again to you. In patients with primary infertility, thin endometrium with a tubal factor but a negative IGRA, gene expert and AFB culture, should we start ATT?
No, but everything is anything positive.
Negative.
If everything is negative, you can't give empirical treatment to these patients. But yes, as Kaveri was saying, if PCR is positive, thin endometrium, so then possibly you can. But at least something should be there. Just only on the basis of thin endometrium, unless you should have some high suspicion. So what my guess is that if you are really clinically, you are strongly suspecting Dr. Kaveri that she has got tuberculosis, all other features, but you are not finding any molecular testing possible, then you do a histoscopy or laparoscopy on them. And on histoscopy, you can show sign that, okay, thin endometrium, pale cavity, and then possibly you can start ATT on that basis. But you have to document some evidence of that.
Correct, ma'am. Correct, sir. There is one question to Dr. Kaveri, ma'am. Ma'am, can you please again explain how to make 150 IU of HCG?
The HCG is made in a 1:1 dilution. So, for example, you have 500 units of HCG and you have 5 ml of water for injection. Then both are mixed and kept in a syringe or a vial. It is to be kept at the fridge temperature. It has to be collected in the dose that we give to the patient has to be titrated in the insulin syringe. So, for example, if you have a 1:1 dilution of HCG, and then you take about 150 IU on the insulin syringe, which will be equivalent to 150 units of HCG.
Correct, ma'am. And second question again to you. What is your experience regarding the outcome in patients with persistently thin endometrium with a good trilaminar character where anatomical causes are ruled out and all the other modalities of treatment have failed? So how do you plan?
So this is what I have also discussed in the talk, that if the endometrium is thin, so say it is 6 millimeters, but it is trilaminar and all other causes have been ruled out. Usually this group of patients have a good overall prognosis. So for example, in your ovulation induction cycles, if a good follicle is forming, your endometrium is 6.2, but it is trilaminar, you've taken a good history, you should not stop that cycle. You must proceed and do your IUI or natural contact or IVF if necessary.
Right, ma'am. Thank you. And again to Dr. Sharma sir, further to that question of tubo-ovarian abscess, they are asking if on relook at 6 months, if still any evidence of disease, can we extend AKT?
Well, actually, we have done study 6 months versus 9 months. Before that, people were routinely giving 9 months, 1 year treatment to these patients. But what we have observed that, whether you give them 6 months or 9 months, the results were equally good or equally bad. Actually, what are we trying to treat, man? If you are trying to, even after the end of the therapy, even if you give 1 year AT to these patients, the fibrosis and all will still be there. So active disease disappear. That is, we have repeated laparoscopy on these patients. So those peri-adhesions will persist. Fibrosis will persist, but active disease will disappear. So we have to treat the active disease, not the fibrosis, not the adhesion, which you can now not never treat, even if you extend the disease. But definitely, like what we tend to do, we repeat the test on them. If you find active tuberculosis again, and then if it is active tuberculosis, it should have responded by now. So then you have to rule out, could it be MDR-TB? We have seen 2 cases of MDR-TB also, FCG-TB. So either you must rule out that number, or number 2, because just giving for another 3 months may not help much actually. But definitely, I mean, you can extend for 3 months. Some patients we do extend. If you like, if they think that, okay, patient has improved by 80%, but 20% is still left there. So 3 months extension can be allowed for 9 months, but not beyond that. Because like even for lymph node tuberculosis, sometimes if you see, they will have persistent lymph node mass, which is fibrotic lymph node, which will remain forever. Even if you give 2 years, it will not, and we are not going to treat that. That is fibrotic lymph node, need not be treated. Similarly, fibrotic tubes and all, they may not be treated.
Thank you, sir. And again, they are further asking, can we do drainage through colpotomy?
Yeah, you can do if possible. I mean, in fact, that may be a safer option for them. But again, whenever you are doing, make sure the sigmoid colony is very much close to them. So under ultrasonic control, they should have good experience of that. They definitely with a fine needle, like just like you are taking aspirating OM, I mean, through that route. So they can do that also. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Ma'am, there is a question for you. If we encounter thin endometrium during IUI, how do we treat? Means at what time should we supplement estrogen in the same cycle and how?
So in an IUI cycle, usually the first ultrasound is done around the 8th to the 10th day. So if at that point we should actually get an endometrium of about 7 millimeters, and it should be going towards the trilaminar zone. So if on the 8th or 9th day we are not getting a good endometrium, say we've got only 6 or 5.8, and the follicle is growing well, then at that point also supplementations of estrogen, sildenafil can be done. However, we have seen that with the next scan, the endometrium improves in many cases. The drawback of starting estrogen too early is that it may downregulate the growth and speed of the follicle also. So yes, you can start estrogen late in an IUI cycle, but more important, that is what you have done in the previous workup of that patient. This is very, very important to be sure. Just adding estrogen in an adhesion, uterus with an adhesion will not help. So have you done a hysteroscopy? Have you done the adhesiolysis? Have you ruled out other causes of thin endometrium? And then you can start with your supplements. We have also added GCSF in IUI cycles with reasonably good results. I would like to add a comment here and ask Professor Sharma that in our previous discussions, we had discussion about when there is tuberculosis PCR positive, then whether we should do laparoscopy or not. So if we could get Professor Sharma on board, then we could have a few questions to him, because many of the doctors are keen to know this. So Sonal, if you could get him on board.
Sharma sir?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Yeah, Professor Sharma, I had a remark to make. We had discussed it last time also, and many of the gynecologists, they asked the question that only in PCR positive, do we need to do laparoscopy? Say the patient is gone for ART, she has blocked tubes and she needs IVF, and we have done PCR, it's positive. What is our stand as far as starting ATT? To whom should we notify? Should we always do a laparoscopy? So can you clarify all
Yeah,
this?
I mean, it's a very controversial and difficult question to answer, because there is no definite guidelines of the government for that. But what is clear, that government is very clear, RNTCP, I mean, our National Tuberculosis Elimination Program, as well as this thing, they are clear that only on the basis of PCR we can't start the treatment. Though as gynecologist, even I am giving some time, but so medical legally also we can be in a thick soup if we give only on the basis of PCR. But definitely, so that's what I'm trying to say, that document in your notes. If you have this gut feeling that this patient has got tuberculosis positive PCR, then document something at least. I mean, you can combine that with ultrasound scan. A good ultrasoundologist like you can pick up thin endometrium, you can pick up some fluid, you can see cobweb appearance, some some hydrosalpinx element on that. So document that. Okay, ultrasonic evidence of tuberculosis with positive PCR with infertility, then you are justifiable. If you can't do laparoscopy, otherwise, if you will do laparoscopy, definitely you will find some finding on them. So in those flimsy adhesions, peritubal adhesions, some straw-colored fluid, some ancestral ascites, some hydrosalpinx, some hyperemic tube. So any of those evidences go in favor of starting ATT to these patients. And then only, because even if you do IVF on these patients without giving ATT, results are going to be poorer.
Surely.
So that has been experience. So this
And
you have
what
to
about notification, sir? Whom do we
yeah,
notify?
now the government does say that you have to notify them. So for that, actually, it's not difficult. You can make your own account at www.niksha.com. Niksha is the other Hindi name of tuberculosis. So there is this thing, you can make your own site and you can start reporting to them. But they give you some incentive also. And patient also gets some, I think, 500 rupees a month, some money. But otherwise, what I do, I refer all my patients to our dot center. So you can refer to dot center, then they will report it. So your side is clear. So I don't have to report, because my dot center, they report and they give free medicine to the patient also. Otherwise, you can write. So ideally, though no case has happened, but theoretically, it may become illegal not to report.
Sure.
And theoretically, there may be penalization in future. So best is refer to the dot center. Even if you starting treatment, this thing, that refer to your dot center, that please for notification. Otherwise, or you can make your own site on www.niksha.com. It's not very difficult. It's just like for PNC, this PCP NDT Act, all of us are, according to same way you can do on that, and there is no, otherwise no penalization. Very easy, just initial agitation is there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And sir, similar questions from the audience also, they were asking, is it medico-legally safe to give anti-cox treatment based on only clinical suspicions when laboratory tests are negative? And the second question they are asking, if you see tubercle on laparoscopic examination, but all tests are negative, can we give ATT?
Yeah, if on laparoscopic basis, you can start ATT. And that, why did you do laparoscopy for that patient? There must be some reason. No? She must be infertile, isn't it? You want to laparoscopy on an, fertile patient. So the mere fact that patient has got some oligomenorrhea, patient has got some infertility, patient has got, you do laparoscopy and you find some tubercle. So, she's a case of early tuberculosis. In fact, these are the patients, that's what I feel, these are the patients where the treatment will be useful. If the patient which I showed you, that's, laparoscopy picture, which tubes were totally gone, totally frozen pelvis. In that case, no treatment is going to be effective. In Kaveri will refuse to take those cases, and they are too advanced. In IVF will not be working for them. So probably we are missing somewhere. By the time they come to advanced stage, when all tests will be positive, but then for infertility, they are very poor patients. So ideally, we should try to diagnose it in early stage. So there may be some logic in that, like Dr. Sonia Malik and all of you say that even on the basis of PCR, some people treat, and that is what they are treating. They are treating in the latent phase, because even Dr. B.N. Chakravarti from Kolkata has proven that latent tuberculosis important cause of IVF and implantation failure. So probably that there is a role of there also. So tuberculosis does play a role, but definitely even in medicine and all, sometimes clinically, on clinical basis, anti-tuberculosis therapy can be allowed. That is totally safe, legal. You have to justify that. So what I tend to do, I always do laparoscopy, cystoscopy on them, and then say that, okay, laparoscopy finding of tuberculosis seen, and then I write laparoscopic evidence of tuberculosis seen, the impression genital tuberculosis, advise ATT 6 months ATT through dot center. So then, and I put my name, signature, nobody can challenge that. And even if the case goes to court, I have got evidence on laparoscopy. Let the judge come and do laparoscopy and see, So basically, it's just, but only on the basis of PCR, there have been some case apparently, only on that basis. So do little bit, careful, add something. Maybe laparoscopy, positive PCR with ultrasound finding. If you're a good ultrasoundologist like Kaveri and Malhotra or Dr. Ashok Khurana, they can pick up tuberculosis where many others have missed it, So if you have that in mind, like that, even little bit of fluid, thin endometrium and all that can be picked up early stages of tuberculosis, and then you are justified in starting it.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Dr. Kaveri ma'am, for giving us very insightful lecture and giving us all practical tips and answers to our questions. Our viewers are also thanking you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It
Thank
was a
you.
great
Thank
opportunity.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Mr. Satpathy. Thank
I
you.
think we had good number of delegates. We had around close to 650 active participants, and I could see a lot of questions coming from everyone. And I heard through the whole session, and it was quite informative for me also. Thank you so much, Dr. Sama and Kaveri.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best. Thank you.